with no further ado, on to the main reason we're here, and that's to listen to Owen Mountford talk to us about the Fenland Flora. Owen?
Thanks very much indeed. Again, being something of a technophobe, I'm going to just double check that people online can hear me if I stand about here. That's okay? Yep, yep, splendid. Okay. Well, my talk is entitled Survival Against the Odds, and in, I suppose, contrast to most presidential addresses, it is a two-hander. It would be invidious of me just to put my name up there for a project which from its very beginning has been run jointly between myself and John Graham, who's based in my old hometown of Whittlesea. Ah, this was working beautifully. Oh. Well, there's the first technical halt. Sorry, everybody, if this starts to work, then. This wasn't the problem we envisaged. Try that. Yep, there we go, I think. Thanks, mate. So my talk has a structure to it. I'm going to ask what local floras are for. And then, I suppose, following naturally from that, why write a flora for the Fenland? What are going to be its special features? What justifies that? I want to sort of look a little bit retrospectively, though I'm not a paleocologist or somebody like that who can really talk with in an informed way about past vegetation types. But I want to sort of talk about why Fenland was important right up until historical times. To look at the question, where does the natural, in heavy inverted commas, flora of Fenland survive? But also because this is what has interested me most in my research career. What are the habitats that people have created that allow native species to survive within Fenland? And also, what are the habitats that have allowed new species native to Britain, but which could possibly never be claimed as a natural part of the Fenland flora, to come in and occupy this area? To give at least some time to the most extensive habitats of Fenland, the bits that we do tend to drive past rather than stop and explore. And to ask the question, whereabouts are the species in Lincolnshire? I've always been based between Huntingdonshire, Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Lincolnshire in about equal measures. I currently live in Cambridgeshire, but I hope you will find this a talk which to some extent dissolves county boundaries, but also emphasises the special contribution of Lincolnshire to Fenland. And that's why I'm allowing myself what I hope is a short personal epilogue. So what are local floras for? Most of you, because these are LNU publications, will recognise Adrian Woodruff-Peacock. You'll recognise Joan Gibbons's Flora, and then the supplement produced by herself and Irene Western. These are essentially the only full coverage of Lincolnshire at a flora level. And Woodruff-Peacock broke ground, but he was very cautious, unassuming in what he said. The pamphlet he says that he produced, published by the LNU, claims no merit, except that it is a practical study and a signpost to the way for a flora, to be followed more than 60 years later by Joan Gibbons's work. Should a flora be a historical account, or should it be a snapshot in time? Are we interested in like the period of the survey, maybe the lifespan of the author as the snapshot, or a shorter period? What should a flora try and encompass? And because there are so few of them, all the Lincolnshire publications have synthesized not only modern work by those botanists, but also mining historical work going back to Gerard and Turner, and putting that into the context of Lincolnshire as a whole. So all these works cover centuries. They are not, in a sense, snapshots in time. It's worth just stepping aside for a moment to ask, well, where did the modern flora come from? Because I collect old floras and love them. But there was a step change in this immediately after the Second World War, when John Doney, working in Bedfordshire, introduced certain things into his flora which are now standard. He asked the question, where do species occur now? Where did they occur? What were the locations and habitats? If there has been a change, he sought to explain that change rather than just to state it baldly. And he very much at that time, his great innovation was to introduce habitat studies. In other words, it was never going to be just a catalogue of species and locations. It was going to be which ones grow together, in what conditions, what are the habitats, and by implication, what conservation is needed. And floras have then sort of widened or narrowed the scope a little bit taxonomically. Usually they've taken on board the flowering plants and the pteridophytes, but sometimes also the ferns, the algae and the lichens. And then the other sort of variable component is it just the native species or the established introductions, or are we going to go whole hog into casuals and gardenscapes too? Now, as a Fenland person, I hope with affinities to all the counties, I have to admit that past history in the different counties is very variable in terms of the number of accounts you've had. Cambridgeshire, I'm afraid, rather wins out. Everything from John Ray in 1660 right the way through to Alan Leslie 2 or 3 years ago. If a date is in brackets, it means a minor publication or a supplement or something like that. But you see the number of accounts that we have. So Cambridgeshire is in a very good position to recount historically what has happened to its flora. Huntingdonshire not so good, starting much later, and with only one full flora as such, although George Claridge Druce did produce an interesting account in the Victoria County history. Lincolnshire, our county, has those 3 major publications that I've alluded to already. And I think the reason we see so few is the very size of the county and the relatively low population. Norfolk often claims to be the premier wildlife county and certainly has had a good history of publications. Northamptonshire, not so strong, but it's been very active in recent years. And Suffolk, yes, a good history of major floras, but only really 3 of them. So why did we decide to write a Fenland Flora? We thought there was a justification, both in conservation terms and ecological terms, to forget county boundaries for a moment and think about a landscape unit, something that was brought together with a similar geology and soils, similar climate, similar land uses, history and ecology, and see what the patterns were in an area like that. We would therefore, we thought, be able to focus within the flora on what the causes of these distributions were, rather than simply dismiss them by the usual thing in county floras, where you've got a bit of this rock, a bit of that elevation, you've got a bit of that habitat, and they're spread and they're brought together, if you like, in a county potpourri. And you're not learning, in a sense, much about the individual landscape elements, just their contrast one to another. So that was our justification, to do something holistic, integrated. There was one precedent that we had for the idea, anyhow, and that was John Trist's Ecological Flora of Breckland, which does precisely that, taking in bits of Suffolk, bits of Norfolk, bits of Cambridgeshire, but doing it in a relatively brief way and with some rather confusing maps, if you know the book itself. The other justification, and we have to stress this, is as almost Fenland naturalists and as nationalists, John and I felt there was a justification in doing the job simply because Fenland had been ignored or underlooked at by many botanists in the past. There are some honourable exceptions, of course, but compared to the up highlands of southern Cambridgeshire, for example, the county that I know best, the Fenland was known very poorly. So what will the Fenland Flora accounts have? This is a kind of annotated content page, and it gives you some idea as to what is already in the written flora and which will be part of the final published flora due in about probably 15 to 18 months. It discusses the scientific names, the vernacular names. One of the joys of this has also been trying to look up names used only by local people from, say, the Stoke of Peterborough or from Lincolnshire or whatever, rather than just rely on the rather dry standard English names. To come up with an account of the variation, both to have some regard to nationally, but to focus principally on what are the variants that are present in Fenland. And then to depict the changes in the distribution through tetrad maps where possible, showing the situation prior to 1970, for the last 3 decades of the 20th century and into the current century. Like many florists, to find out what the earliest record for Fenland is. Here, a very honourable mention goes to a man, William Scrimshire, based at Wisbeach, who gathered records from South Lincolnshire, from North Cambridgeshire, and from West Norfolk. And in many cases, his is the first Fenland record, dated around 1800. To present the evidence for it being native or to have come in thanks to human beings, either in antiquity or recently, and then to sort of discuss the distribution and habitats that the data we have show for the 19th century and before, if possible, and then into these phases that we use for the mapping. One of the things I'm going to dwell on in a moment is the analysis of the distribution, some work done by my colleague Mark Hill, with whom I worked closely at CEH at Monk's Wood for a long time, to discuss a little bit the reproduction and of the plant and reasons for distribution and dispersal, and to talk about nature conservation. So each account has all those elements, which is why it's turning into a tome. Also, we have colleagues and friends writing contextual chapters, because we want people to this not just to be a set of species accounts, but to be something which really creates a baseline for Fenland for the future. So like many florists, to discuss how the flora was recorded, both now and in the past, to look at the habitats that are present, to discuss geology and soils and ancient plant communities and evidence for that. The special feature for Fenland clearly is to look at drainage and its history. To look as well at social history. Here, a special mention must be made of somebody who's a good Lincolnshire person, name possibly known to some of you, Rex Sly, who is drafting our chapter on social history and agricultural history. A person who's done a huge amount of research on precisely that topic. Then to look at how urbanization and transport have affected Fenland in the last century, 2 centuries. And finally, to dwell again on nature conservation and habitat restoration. Now, this image is not particularly good on the screen. I hope it's, happily the message from it is fairly straightforward. This relates to a piece of work that I led on behalf of Natural England, looking at habitats within the Fens National Character Area. And this is part of the land cover map, which was published by colleagues in CEH in 2007. The essential feature to look at is that the map is Fenland is brown. We are talking about a sea of arable. But those of you with good eyesight will see a stippling of green here and there, largely talking about improved grassland, but sometimes older grassland. And there are some features which really do stand out, like the ooze washes, the Neen washes, and sadly the definition isn't quite good enough to pick out the towns, but Wisbech, Lynn, Spalding, Boston, and of course the salt marsh habitats along the Wash. So although brown dominates, it is not the only story. And Fenland is still dynamic. These figures were combined, the ones for 2007, with work by Dudley Stamp's survey from the 1930s. And you'll see in that time how arable had risen markedly, grasslands had diminished, woodlands had increased, planting of shelter belts and so on, and orchards had almost disappeared. Those of you who know the Wisbech area will acknowledge that that has been the case. Some people can criticize those data because Stamp's information was gathered during a period of agricultural depression, but it still reflects real trends. So, what are the habitat categories? I'm going to skate over this because I really just was going to develop it in a moment by examples. But we can talk about where the semi-natural or natural habitats are still present, including that habitat which defines our region, Fenland, but also salt marsh and rivers. We can talk about those which are created as part of the reclamation drainage process, those which are, and most of which are freshwater or wetland in nature, and then a group of habitats which are created as villages and settlements begin to grow on the drained land, particularly in the townlands between Kings Lynn, Holbeach, and up to Boston and Wrangle and so on. The old settlements of Fenland with their older grassland fragments and their hedges. And then finally, the truly artificial, actually, the churchyards, the urban land, and so on, habitats which have been which have developed in the landscape, some of which, like churchyards, may be preserving old swards, but largely new and artificial habitats. And of course, arable. This is a group of botanists, including my colleague John is hidden, but those two people are Caroline Steele and Jeremy Fraser, looking at the population of common cotton grass by the Nocturne Delph. And we have a kind of, this is a very subjective list I've produced here, but it emphasizes people, the contribution of people in the late 18th, early 19th, early 20th century, the classic work of Joan Gibbons and Irene Weston and I think William Peat, then a flowering of Fenland botany in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Then the group that, if you like, we worked with most closely, the BSBI recorders and some very active botanists, and a new generation, Lewis Saunders at Wisbech and Adam Lucas at Boston, taking the recording into the third decade of this century. So what was Fenland important for? It was, yes, it was a landscape with tall herb, rich fen in it, but it also had considerable areas of raised bog. It also had mire forests, and what the species that are characteristic of these three elements have survived to a greater or sometimes a lesser extent in the Fenland. It had the largest lakes in lowland England. It had these wonderful alluvial wetlands, floodplain wetlands associated with the great rivers and estuaries. And it had some of the most extensive salt marshes in Britain. It was a biological biodiversity hotspot, undoubtedly. And as it gradually was affected by drainage and growing populations, some really very positive developments came along. The development of lowland meadows, of more standing water habitats with different sorts of history, size and management, and fragments that were preserved either by peat cutting or because certain Fenland projects were seen as important. I'm saying I'm not a palynologist, but these sorts of diagrams, this is a pollen diagram from Hockham Mere, which is the present day Cranberry Rough in Norfolk, just off the east side of Fenland. And it sort of shows how over the last 14 to 15,000 years, how very different the vegetation of the Fenland Basin has been in terms of woody growth, of herbaceous growth, and of pteridophytes and so on. Looking at what we think of conserving that which we knew as children or that which was present in the last century. But Fenland vegetation has been many things at different times. And evidence for this comes not only from palynological information, but also from archaeology, conventional archaeology, looking at certain sites. So near my old hometown of Whittlesea, the Bronze Age excavations at Must Farm have had a huge impact on our knowledge of which species were present as natives in the late Bronze Age. We can do a similar thing for Iron Age species by cores taken from Stony Camp near Chatteris. And because Harry Godwin, the author of the History of the British Flora, was based in Cambridge and had a particular love of Fenland, we have a better idea of the history of Fenland botany than almost any other portion of Britain. And here I'm really going to sort of try and fly the flag for Fenland. Here are the great estuarine wetlands of Europe, from the Volga to the Delta Donari, to the Camargue, to Coto Doñana, to the Rhine, to Fenland. I beg to move that case for Fenland being considered, at least historically, in that context. The vegetation would have been something like this in places. Now, this is stretching a point a little, but I think it's a reasonable stretch. This is the kind of subarctic wetland, a mixture of raised mire, blanket mire, and mire forest from a visit I made to the Ob-Irtish area in central Siberia. And it gives some idea of what Fenland might once have been like. With those areas of bog, of acid peat, interspersed with areas irrigated with limey water, like this tall herb fen from Estonia. And maybe that's the kind of landscape, to some extent, we could envisage in primeval Fenland. But of course, we know that there was a marked impact of drainage and other activities. Ditching, at first to remove surface water, then a technological development to improve the quality of pumps, removing water. People moving as well in under drainage from just using ditches or permanent backfill and gradually moving up through clay tiles to plastic piping to regular mold ploughing, removing water from the growing area, making almost anywhere in Fenland able to be ploughed and sown with a crop. The relic natural habitats, though, did hang on here and there. So let's think again historically for a moment. I don't apologize for Huntingdonshire example here, because it's such a classic piece of work, showing the ground level at Home Fen in 1848, and showing how with each successive improvement in technology, there is more removal of water, more oxidation of the peat, and a lower and lower ground level. This kind of trace, which is so well known for Home Fen, can be traced in lots of other parts of Fenland. Lincolnshire has this very special place in Fenland history. Maybe the last great wilderness in Fenland was the East Fen. Here's a map of the Deeps and the East Fen in 1661. And there are still species which are associated with that area and nowhere else in Fenland. The changes that happened following Joseph Banks's surveys in that area, with big drains being put in, including the Hob Hole and the fodder dike and so on, gradually meaning that all that land could go into arable. Though still with 19th century accounts of bushels and bushels of cranberries being taken off the mires near Wainfleet and Friskney. So a fascinating area. And of course, the last home of plants like Tephroceras congesta, the marsh fleawort. Similar story back in Huntingdonshire, showing the end of the great Fenland lakes, reclamation at first, and some abandonment until the technology allowed these areas to be ploughed more successfully. So you had drained land, which acquired a rough fenny vegetation, and then came into arable. And the change is because continued sort of incrementally ever since. This is a nice picture, a nice map taken from the boundaries between Norfolk and Lincolnshire near Terrington St Clement, and shows the dates of various reclamation. So we have the sort of medieval and earlier 18th century there, 19th century, early 20th century here, and then into the late 20th century at that point. So we have a series of different blocks of land with different ages, different problems for plants colonizing, different floras. Where do the natural habitats survive? Some of them are shown on this diagram. I wouldn't be too hung up about exactly which habitat it is, because these sort of classifications often apply different labels to the same patch of land, because they're recognizing that reed bed, tall fen, and fen meadow may be mixed in together as a mosaic. But all I really want you to notice is, again, the dominance of the washlands, but also we've got Baston and the Lower Glen. We've got habitats here and there, mostly on the peat. On that evidence, you would suggest that where the peat is most extensive, in the south and southwest of Fenland, that's where there's been the greatest survival. But that's not, that generalization doesn't apply if you start to look closely. Habitat and landscapes go together. Some points here which we've used a landscape unit, but that landscape unit defined a suite of habitats. So here, between Fiskerton and Branston, we have a landscape here of irregular fields and hedges, irregular roads, and then the familiar checkerboard pattern of the Witham Fens. So first of all, a different landscape mosaic, a different landscape geometry defines Fenland. Then we have issues of isolation. We have here the Friskney Decoy Wood, a Wildlife Trust Reserve, surrounded in what looks like a very inhospitable area, but which contains still some of the relics of that deep East Fen peaty vegetation, very rich bryophyte and pteridophyte flora, and then species like Keratocapnos, the climbing corridalis, being present as well. We have the impact of reclamation, drawing sharp lines where there wouldn't be sharp lines. So here again on the Lincolnshire coast, we have the mud flats with their salicornia. We have some of the most important extensive salt marshes in Britain. And then we have a sharp line, but we have relic brackish communities in the drainage channels and banks further in. What I suppose attracted both John and me to the Fenland in the first place were habitats like these, the washes and the drains. That's Baston Fen in the top there and Morton's Leam on the Neen washes in the south. These habitats were clearly of national importance. There's no argument about that at all. Yet they were included in a dismissive attitude to Fenland that there was nothing of value in this huge area. Industry is not something you associate with Fenland, but it has had it has had some impact here and there. Most obvious to do with borrow pits and gravel pits from everywhere like Tattershall and along the major drains, to this particular example in my old hometown of Whittlesea, which shows how much variation there can be in Fenland at quite a small level. So Watchland meadows and ditches here, winter flooded, old grasslands standing proud on the island here, urban habitats, and then new habitats here developing on abandoned, worked out pits, one of which has now become a nature reserve, King's Dyke Nature Reserve, and has one of the best floras of any place in Fenland. Bring it right up to date, we have had attempts in many parts of Fenland to create or to recreate new habitats. This is the example of Willow Tree Fen, not too far from Bourne, but there are examples all the way around Fenland. And Fenland could claim to be the centre of habitat creation, habitat restoration in Britain as a whole. Now, there are going to be, I'm afraid, a few dot maps now. I don't apologise for this, but I want to sort of make a few points using them. These maps, particular maps, were created by Mark Hill, and they show the co-occurrence of species of particular, which from particular and from analysis appear to have the similar sorts of distribution in Fenland. Now, where there is a grey dot, that does not mean there are none of these species. It means there are less than 23 of them. So these coast and sand species do occur elsewhere. But where you get the medium-sized brown dot or the big brown dot, there are lots of them. So we can say that this fairly obviously, and not really sort of something to hold the front page for, coast and sand habitats very concentrated in the Snettisham area, but with outliers where you have important gravel pits and sand pits. Salt marsh, following the tidal rivers. Where along the tidal rivers they fade out is a particular interest of mine, and the impact of sea defences, of tidal control, is perceptible in the historical record. That is Snettisham and Heacham, which, if you like, is the Fenland sandy coast. And now an apology to Lincolnshire, but we had to draw the line somewhere. And so we fixed the northeastern boundary of Fenland as the Wainfleet Haven, the Steeping River, which meant we couldn't also claim Gibraltar Point. So we are missing, if you like, a counterbalance to Snettisham within the flora, although we do refer to it quite a lot, despite it being outside our patch. The salt marshes are an area which has received particular attention recently. My colleague, John Graham, has been involved in major surveys of the salt marshes all the way from Lynn around into Lincolnshire and up as far as Wrangle and Wainfleet. So we hope that these rather inhospitable and sometimes risky, dangerous places have now got proper coverage. We then have a suite of species which are associated with what we might define as the jewel of Fenland, the old relic tall herb fen, semi-natural fen. Here, the usual suspects come up: Wicken and Woodwalton and home fen. So does Baston. So does an area in the lower Nar around Wormgate. And there is some evidence of these sorts of species in the Upper Witham. Plants, I mean, some of these species are now extremely restricted in Fenland and are on the point of extinction if you think of the site as a whole, the region as a whole. Things like sweet gale and fen sedge, saw sedge. Habitat that's more widespread is one which we could infer developed as the rich fen was drained. The upper parts of the peat were leached and became covered in trees. So the birch woodlands of home fen, obviously the best known example, but these peaty woodlands are up the east side of Fenland and around the margin of the Witham, and also at places like Friskney Decoy, which is one of the best examples in Lincolnshire. What are the habitats that have been created, and which really, I suppose, in the end, we have spent the most time studying in the last couple of decades? Well, these would be those created to control water. So washland to take the excess water in winter, drainage channels to move water about and to remove it from fields, reservoirs for irrigation and pits created by industry, and then the big engineering flood banks associated with those drainage channels. And we get distributions which again pick out certain areas in Fenland as being of particular importance. So if we pick up the washland suite of species, it's around Wicken, it's along the Ouse Washes, the Nene Washes, the Glen and the Welland. It's here and there along the Witham, though not particularly well developed. It's more sporadic there. But remember that some of these species, to reinforce that point, some of these washland specialists are present even in these grey squares. It's just that there aren't very many of them. Or we have species associated with the main river channels and the big drains, the big arterial drains, like the Hob Hole and so on. And this map really does pick out the rivers really quite well and emphasizes how the riverine flora begins to thin out as you get tidal influence, or where in some cases you've got more pollution, but it's usually the tidal influence that's the big story. But again, the Witham, various drains like the Dunham drain, the Steeping River. Again, we've got the Welland and Glen here, and then the Nar, the Wissey, Little Ouse, the Cam, and so on. You can see each of the rivers pulled out with a distinctive riverine flora. Similar stories can be told about the next grade down, the internal drainage board ditches, which are regularly cleaned and therefore don't get clogged with tall emergence. And we get again this picture of species along the inner side of Fenland and along the washes. But look at this lovely sort of train of very rich habitats along the west side of Lincolnshire. And the same can be for another suite of species with a very similar distribution, but ecologically not actually in the water so much as at its very edge and associated with banks that are cleaned regularly. So the drain edge habitat. You get plants like this, some of them very familiar, like water mint and water forget-me-not. So we often, some of our best, some of the species in Fenland, we might regard in some parts of our county as quite common, but their distribution in Fenland can be very precise and determined by these sort of management and historical factors. One habitat I want to just draw attention to and to emphasize are these shallow groundwater fed, highly calcareous ditches. They are something of a national resource. They are concentrated between Peterborough, going up to sort of Billingborough and so on. They're sparingly elsewhere. You get them near Hackney a bit. But you'll see that over much, in that contrast to those other habitats which seem to like the peaty land of Cambridgeshire, this is very much a West Fenland, a Lincolnshire speciality, and seems to be due to water coming off the Uwelite or sometimes off the base-rich boulder clay and percolating up through the drain bottoms to create open, clear water, highly calcareous. And with species in it like Groenlandia densa, the opposite leaved pondweed, species like the lesser water plantain, Baldelia. These are plants that have now British, English certainly, one could argue even British, but certainly English headquarters within parts of Fenland. More widespread are those species of unkempt and undermanaged drains. So we call these the vegetated ditches. And you can see that this flora is pretty well ubiquitous through inner Fenland, and even has quite large numbers getting out into the coastal areas in places. And it's got species in it. Here's an individual site map for the for Sparganium erectum, the branched burreed, which if that map contributed to that map. And you can see how that is one of the species which thins out in the marshland, in the reclaimed siltlands, and where it might be brackish, and is present where there is peat or where there is older reclamation. Another group of habitats into which we put a lot of time trying to trace them are the old grasslands on flood banks and sea banks and alongside major drains. This is a lovely little area near the horseshoe at Wrangle. It's just a very nice bit of base-rich grassland on a flood bank. Even better in many respects, and happily a good Lincolnshire example, is the outfall of the Nene just south of Sutton Bridge, and to some extent with bits and pieces continuing further north, which has grassland comparable with the best chalk and limestone grassland in our region, but present on a fen drain bank. We also see habitats being created there, or from this old engineering or from the original settlements of hedges and churchyards, which were being created maybe in the late medieval or the Tudor and later periods, creating new opportunities for species to arrive in Fenland. Old grassland then just have this effective hotspots. This is the Soham area of Cambridgeshire, but notice that place, the Nene outfall and the South 40-foot are important, and the ridge at Stickney and going down to Sibsey being very important for certain old grassland species. There is another suite of grassland species with particular distribution, whose presence in Fenland we must regard as modern. They've come in with the impact of mineral excavation for sand and gravel, bringing in of new materials, creating dry, arid, often base poor habitats in a place which never had that kind of habitat before. And obvious examples like that would be the ones around Whittlesea, but also, of course, at Tattershall and along the edge of the Witham there. More obviously as well still, abutting the Greensand in West Norfolk. So habitats like that, which can look pretty unkempt, are mixtures of sort of calcifuge plants that cannot tolerate any waterlogging, open habitats, therefore with lots of ephemerals, lots of annuals in them, so often occurring around the margins of gravel pits, of which the most characteristic species is probably the mouse-ear hawkweed, common enough in many parts of Lincolnshire, but as a Fenland plant, really rather specialised for this group of habitats. People, of course, proverbially talk about Fenland without its trees. They talk about the lack of tree cover. You'll hark back to that slide I showed earlier about actually that tree cover had actually increased in Fenland in the last 70 or 80 years. Now, that is very variable in nature. Admittedly, a lot of it is to do with shelter belts to prevent wind blow, or planted around farms for amenity and so on. But there are old hedges in Fenland, and some of them are super. You even get sort of woodland relics like Moringia trinervia, the three-veined sandwort, or dog's mercury, along some of these old Fenland hedgerows. This is a particularly good example at Ferry Lane, South Tyne, which has a lovely flora underneath underneath the hedges. Their distribution is really rather patchy. I think it might be the eye of faith that is telling me it's associated with the old reclamation and the old Fen Islands further south, like March and Chatteris and so on. So it's land that has been civilized, as it were, for a very long time. And that applies certainly to that suite of species of old grasslands, which presumably were able to colonize Fenland from surrounding uplands as the clearances happened, the drainage happened, settlements were formed, grasslands around the churchyards developed, and a new group of species colonized, forming and then hung on thanks to the sympathetic management that churchyards receive. So our distribution here tends to pick up, again, older towns like Ely, Wisbech. Now where we're there, we're at Spalding and Boston, and then the villages going up towards Wrangle and Friskney. Churchyards in this area can often have the richest grassland flora of any habitat within the Fenland landscape. But we have to admit that these lovely relics, these survival against the odds, are not the only story in Fenland. We do have a matrix within which these beautiful assemblages exist. They may be the main roads, there might be the urban waste grounds, the creation of 19th century engineering, drains and bridges and railways. They may be the disreputable habitats of waste ground and curbs and broken tarmac. And we have plants with, yes, this is a distinctive distribution for the false oak grass. It is just everywhere, on every roadside verge pretty well. Or we have those which are influenced by modern practices, the use of de-icing salt here in the Danish scurvy grass, Cochlearia danica. So these two groups of this species, those which occur along roadsides and track sides and sometimes drain banks as well, everywhere in Fenland, which we call the ubiquitous wayside group, and those which occur where the land is broken to some extent, where we have tillage, or where there, especially to the headlands of arable fields, but also gardens and other disturbed places. And you'll see that habitat does thin out a little bit in parts of Lincolnshire. It's interesting. So plants like this, these are the common everyday plants of absolutely every tetrad anywhere in Fenland. The capsella, the shepherd's purse, the white archangel, white dead nettle, Lamium album. Now here I've got a point to make, which I find quite interesting. We then have a group of species. This is a group of species which are associated with older road verges. So again, we have so these are roadsides, tracksides, which have been around for several centuries. And they're very much associated either with the earliest drainage efforts or the Fen Islands or the townlands and the winding lanes of South Lincolnshire, not the gridiron lanes you see further south in the peat fen. There's then a group of verge species which seem to only occur where management is more sympathetic or more regular. This includes all sorts of commonplace stuff like red clover or bird's foot trefoil. So plants that would be regarded as commonplace, but actually thin out in parts of the Fenland. Now, I think there's something significant here. Look how many of them there are in West Norfolk, how relatively common they are in North Lincolnshire, in Lindsey, but how they thin out in Holland and those bits of Kesteven that get into the Fenland. And I wonder whether that's a difference in district council roadside verge management. I just throw that out just in case anybody can comment upon it. It's possible. We've looked in depth at the arable farming, and there's a special suite of species which sadly is one of our main sort of newly created groups, not so obvious, ones that are associated either with very peaty soils or soils influenced by chalk, and which include things like common violet, that is the modern name for scarlet pimpernel, flicksweed, fool's parsley, wild mignonette, annual mercury, allseed, and hemp nettle. And they do appear to be something of a Cambridgeshire group, maybe because of the chalk, maybe because of the peat. They have a limited presence in the Witham. And knowing the work that Sarah has done in South Lincolnshire recently, and that Paul Kirby has done in North Lincolnshire, I am sure these absences are real. So that again is a question to ask. Why are this suite of species so uncommon in that area? They're present, again, a third time is saying, some of them are present, but not in large number or variety. One of the last and easiest groups to define are the species of walls, like the yellow corridalis and hart's tongue fern. And here really they do pick out certain older settlements. Ely comes straight out, Wisbeach does, King's Lynn does, Spalding does. Interestingly, so does Whittlesea, which doesn't have that many old buildings in it. But it surprises me that Boston didn't. It has a reasonable wall flora, but it doesn't pass this threshold. And I'm not really clear again why that should be so. We have a lot of restoration schemes going on, and here Lincolnshire has two to claim, and they all follow this pattern of the inner side of the Fenland. So much of the distribution of species in Fenland and conservation effort follows this kind of inner Fenland zonation and marshland where things are either more neglected or are reckoned to be not so interesting. We would argue that that is not deserved in many cases. And that, almost to sum up, is how many species we found. We have a total of about 3,500 species or subspecies recorded in Fenland. Now that includes everything from garden escapes to national rarities, but it is a rich flora. And many of the tetrads we have are in this red range of at least almost from anything from 200 to 400 species, and they're pretty common. But it's worth pointing out the green hotspots with 400 to 600 species. And in Lincolnshire terms, these are in the Witham, between Greetwell and Washington, possibly reflecting the past works of botanists there. Around Tattershall, Stickney. In the north part of Boston, that is a positive urban effect, so that's possibly elevated a little bit because of garden escapes and so on, but also antiquity and diversity of habitat and landscape, and down at Spalding as well. And of course, the very, very honourable Baston and Fen and its environs. So there is something of an urban effect maybe in places, pumping up the species list, but there are hotspots in Lincolnshire. And as I come towards my conclusion, it's worth sort of saying, one ends up being a little bit of a prophet or a proselytizer of Fenland, because I think people like Annette would also probably call herself that. Fenland needs its champions, but sometimes maybe we ought to look to others to justify our strong opinion of the place. And what this shows is some work done by the University of East Anglia's Fen Biodiversity Audit, done about 10 years ago now, when they looked at all taxa, including invertebrates, vertebrates, bryophytes, vascular plants, and so on. And they came up with this list of these numbers, nearly nearly 13,500 species, nearly 2,000 priority species under those criteria. Over a quarter of the UK bat species were in Fenland. There was a strong representation, despite everything, of Fen specialists, some almost entirely restricted to this region, some having one of their two or three or a handful of strongholds in the Fens, and of another 35 with a secondary stronghold. These data, these figures are impressive in themselves, but they are almost exactly the same data that came up for Breckland and broadland when the same unit did work. Now, no one in nature conservation would decry Breckland or broadland. These are famous botanical and ecological and ornithological and entomological hotspots. Fenland is every bit as good as those, and needs emphasising. My last point to make is this personal one. I've been a fenman since 1968. I owe my birth to the northeast of England, to County Durham, but I've been here now for a very long time. I've been based around Fenland, both at university and at work, ever since, bar a period when some idiot closed Monk's Wood and I was relocated to Oxfordshire for 5 years. I first got involved in Lincolnshire. I sort of crossed the border near Thorney and Cubbit quite early on, but my first proper survey was with Joan Gibbons in 1970, when I joined a group that she was leading to survey Baston Fen. That was my first introduction both to Joan and to the delights that Lincolnshire could offer. I worked at Monk's Wood most of my career, specialising in the end on grazing marshes, wetland restoration, drainage channels and ditches, very much the stuff of Fenland. The idea came from conversations with people like Joan back in 1970, saying, don't you think it'd be a good idea to make more detailed studies of these areas? And it was developed a bit in the 1990s, but my research kept taking me elsewhere. But it was thanks very much to John Graham in 2005 for saying he'd had the same idea, shouldn't we pool resources? And so that's when the project begins in earnest. And then there are people within the Fens for the Future group who've been stimulating and helpful and actually contributed. The late Richard Chadd was strong amongst those. Rex Sly, who I've alluded to, Caroline Terrow, who many of you will know with EA, and then staff at the Wicken and the Great Fen and many of the other restoration sites. And so I see myself, if you like, as just the latest in a relay of people like John Redshaw, Annette, Roger Parsons, who are speaking for Fenland and underlining what a wonderful area it still can be, and how important in nature conservation terms it is. Thanks very much.